I leaned back into the soft leather of the couch, eyes half focused on the flickering images on the screen, not really watching but appreciating the rare moment of stillness. It had been a long, grueling week, packed with endless meetings, contract negotiations, and the ever-mounting pressure of running a tech company in a market that never seemed to sleep. But now, in the warm glow of the living room, I allowed myself to breathe, just for a moment. The house was quiet, eerily quiet. Madison was usually home by now, but ever since she'd taken up that relentless gym routine, her hours had grown unpredictable. I knew she needed space. She'd been talking about needing to find herself lately, working on her physical and emotional well-being, she said. It made sense at the time. I wasn't the type to question someone's journey towards self-improvement. But I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed a change, a subtle distance growing between us. The door clicked open and I barely glanced up at first. Just Madison coming home, I thought. But then I heard it, a second set of footsteps heavier than hers. My brow furrowed, and I instinctively turned my head, my body stiffening with an alertness I hadn't felt moments ago. Madison walked into the room, but she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a man, younger, taller, and dressed in gym clothes that clung too tightly to his muscular frame. His expression was too casual, a smugness that immediately set my teeth on edge. The discomfort in the room was palpable, though he didn't seem to notice or care. But Madison, oh, she noticed. Her hands twitched slightly, and her eyes flicked to the ground, then back up to me. She was anxious, almost fearful, yet determined. Grant, her voice quivered slightly, betraying her nerves, though her posture remained oddly upright, as if she was trying to brace herself for the inevitable. We need to talk. My gaze shifted from Madison to the stranger at her side. He stared back at me with a level of confidence that was almost unsettling, his body language screaming arrogance. Who was this? A personal trainer? A friend? The question formed in my mind, but I didn't ask it aloud. The answer, it seemed, was coming whether I wanted it or not. This is Jordan, Madison continued, her voice tightening with every word. She swallowed, as if preparing herself for the blow she was about to deliver. I've been seeing him. The words hung in the air, thickening the atmosphere, pulling the warmth from the room. Seeing him. There was no ambiguity in her statement, no confusion to clarify. I knew exactly what she meant, but even so, I waited for her to finish. She hesitated, then glanced at Jordan as if drawing some kind of strength from his presence. My gaze never left her, and she took a breath, her hands fidgeting again, but her voice steadied. I want to continue. I want you to accept this us. I want you to share me with him. The sheer absurdity of what she'd just said didn't register at first. There was no way this was happening. No way my wife was standing here, asking me to what? Share her? As if our life, our marriage, was something that could be divvied up like a joint bank account. I stood up slowly, towering over both of them. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. My pulse thrummed in my ears, but I kept my composure. I wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted, the emotional outburst they probably anticipated. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Madison's eyes flicked to me nervously, her breath catching in her throat. I could see the expectation in her face, the bracing for a confrontation, a shouting match. Jordan, on the other hand, didn't flinch. He just stood there, arms folded, lips curved into a subtle smirk. He was expecting me to fold, to lose it, to break down, maybe even beg. The arrogance in his stance made my stomach turn. I said nothing for a long moment, simply letting the weight of the silence press down on them. Finally, I spoke, my voice low and measured, like ice slicing through the tension. Why? Madison blinked, confused. What? Why would you do this? I asked again, my voice still calm but cold. Why bring him here? Into our home? In front of me? Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected me to be so composed. She swallowed again, then glanced nervously at Jordan before stammering out a response. I've been feeling unfulfilled, Grant. Emotionally. You've been so busy with work, and she paused, wringing her hands together. Jordan understands me in ways that you don't. He He makes me feel alive again. I stayed silent, my gaze unwavering. I didn't need to say anything yet. The more she spoke, the more she dug her own grave. We thought we could make this work, Madison continued, her voice trembling now. As a family. Together. I love you, Grant, but I love him too. It doesn't have to be this way. We can all work this out. Work this out? She was delusional. There was no working out what had already been shattered. But I let her finish. I let her spill her twisted version of reality, where I would somehow, miraculously, accept this betrayal and let her carry on with this derangement. Jordan remained silent throughout, though his posture screamed dominance. He clearly thought he'd won. He didn't realize just how wrong he was. When Madison finally ran out of words, when the silence returned to the room, heavier than before, I spoke again. My voice didn't rise, didn't waver. You've made your choice, I said, my eyes fixed on Madison, though the words were directed at both of them. Now, you'll face the consequences. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them standing there in stunned silence. I didn't slam the door, didn't give them the satisfaction of an outburst. I simply left. As I made my way upstairs, my mind was already calculating my next move. They thought I'd been blindsided, that they'd caught me off guard. But they were wrong. Madison had just crossed a line she could never uncross, and Jordan had no idea what he had stepped into. The house was no longer quiet. It was now the stage for a battle, one they couldn't even begin to understand. I stood in the quiet of my office, the door firmly closed behind me. The soft hum of the city outside the windows was the only sound as I paced back and forth across the room. My mind wasn't racing, it was sharpening. Each step I took was deliberate, every breath measured. I wasn't overwhelmed. No, this was something else entirely. Clarity. Cold, razor-sharp clarity. Downstairs, Madison and her lover, Jordan, were still sitting in my living room. I didn't need to see them to know they were probably exchanging confused glances, trying to figure out what had just happened. They expected a different version of me. A broken man, a desperate husband pleading for his wife's affection, perhaps even a confrontation that would give them the satisfaction of feeling morally justified in their betrayal. They were wrong. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. My footsteps echoed slightly as I stopped by the window, looking out at the skyline of Austin. The city lights flickered in the distance, like small embers of a fire. I'd built everything in my life, this house, this business, this family, brick by brick. It had taken years of sacrifices, long nights, and ruthless decisions. I wasn't going to let anyone tear it down. Least of all them. I needed a plan. Not just a reaction, but a strategy that would leave no room for error. There was no place for emotion in this. Madison's betrayal was a calculated move, and so would be mine. Time passed, though how long I couldn't say. My phone buzzed on the desk. Business. I ignored it. There were more important matters to attend to tonight. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the door, my hands cool, my pulse steady. It was time to re-enter the battlefield. Descending the stairs, the tension was palpable before I even stepped into the room. Madison sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her fingers wringing the fabric of her dress as if it were a lifeline. Jordan, lounging next to her, still wore that insufferable smirk. He looked like he belonged anywhere but here, in a house far beyond his class and understanding. His gaze shifted lazily to me as I walked in. I didn't sit. I didn't need to. Instead, I stood at the edge of the room, just inside the doorway, the weight of my presence cutting through whatever conversation had been brewing between them. I let the silence stretch, thick and oppressive, watching them, studying their discomfort. Finally, Madison broke it, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "Grant, we should talk about this." I could hear the fragility in her tone. She wasn't as sure of herself as she had been earlier, and now, without the safety net of an outburst from me, her confidence was crumbling. I looked at her, no emotion crossing my face, and responded immediately, the words leaving my mouth with a precision that cut like glass. "No, you don't get to explain this away." Her mouth opened slightly, but she quickly closed it, unsure of what to say. The room was still for a beat longer. Then I took a step forward, My eyes locked on hers, cold and steady. "You've been reckless," I continued, my voice firm but calm. "And you've taken everything we've built for granted. But let me make one thing perfectly clear to you, Madison. You're not going to win here. You've already lost." Her breath hitched, and I saw the first flicker of panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth again, trying to salvage something. "It's not what you think, Grant, It's exactly what I think," I interrupted sharply, cutting her off mid-sentence. I wasn't going to listen to her excuses, her justifications, her attempt to rewrite the narrative. "You made your decision the moment you brought him into our home. There's no coming back from that." Jordan, who had been silent up to this point, decided to finally chime in. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Look, man, we didn't mean to blindside you or anything. This doesn't have to be so black and white. People work things out all the time." I turned my gaze on him for the first time since re-entering the room, meeting his eyes with a look that made it clear how little he meant to me. "You don't matter," I said, each word deliberate and heavy. "You never did." For a brief second, I saw his smirk falter, his cockiness wavering as he realized he wasn't in control of anything here. He shifted uncomfortably, his bravado cracking under the weight of my dismissal. But I didn't give him another glance. I turned back to Madison, my attention refocused on the one who truly mattered in all of this. "First thing tomorrow," I said, my tone like iron, "I'm meeting with a divorce lawyer. You will sign those papers. You will walk away from this with nothing, and I will take full custody of the kids." Madison's face paled at the mention of the children. She started to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing her again. "Let me be clear," I continued, stepping closer. "This isn't a negotiation. There's nothing left to negotiate. You made your choice, Madison. Now, you're going to live with the consequences." She looked at me, her eyes wide and filling with desperation. "Grant, please, let's just talk." "No," I said firmly, my patience thinning. "You've had your chance to talk, and this is where we are. You think I'm going to let you parade around with him?" I glanced at Jordan without acknowledging him. "And pretend everything's fine? That I'm going to allow you to stay in this house, live off the life we built together while you tear it apart?" Her lips trembled, and she tried to argue again, but the words died in her throat. She could feel the inevitability of what was coming. Jordan, meanwhile, remained silent, unsure of what to say or do, his earlier arrogance now fading into something more like confusion. He hadn't anticipated this either. He thought I'd crumble, that I'd react in a way that would make them feel justified. But no, this wasn't their game to win. I stepped back, satisfied with their silence. I didn't need to say anything more. The decision had already been made, and the next move was mine. "Tomorrow," I repeated, letting the finality of that word hang in the air. Without another glance, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them both to sit in the suffocating silence I'd created. Upstairs, I sat in my office, opening my laptop. I knew exactly who to call. Monica, a divorce attorney known for her ruthless efficiency and uncompromising nature, was exactly the kind of person I needed right now. As I clicked through the contact list on my phone, finding her number, I felt no hesitation. Tomorrow, this would all start. And by the end of it, Madison would have nothing. I wasn't going to let anyone take from me what I had worked so hard to build. Not Madison, and certainly not Jordan. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a conversation. It was war, and I didn't plan on losing. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines of light across the desk where my phone buzzed softly. I didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. Monica had promised an early call. As I stared out the window, coffee in hand, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The wheels were in motion, and I was ready to hit Madison where it would hurt the most. The divorce papers were already prepared, thorough and unforgiving. Monica had been as relentless as I knew she would be. I hadn't held back when I sat down with her last night, laying out everything, every detail, every date. There was no room for doubt. Monica had pieced it all together into a legal masterpiece, a trap that would snap shut the moment Madison opened that envelope. I heard Madison come downstairs before I saw her. The quiet sound of her footsteps on the hardwood floors was cautious, uncertain. I hadn't spoken to her since last night's confrontation, and I could feel the tension crackling in the air. I didn't bother turning around when I heard her enter the kitchen. She was hovering, unsure whether to address me or pretend everything was normal for as long as she could. A soft rustling of papers told me Monica's courier had delivered the divorce packet right on time. Madison was standing there, reading through the documents that would change her life forever. I knew the moment the reality hit her, because the silence that followed was like a weight dropped into the room. I finally turned, watching her as she clutched the packet in trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Grant," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. What is this?" I leaned against the counter, folding my arms. Exactly what it says. Divorce. Full custody. Everything laid out. She flipped through the pages, her fingers shaking. You can't be serious. Full custody? Grant, we can't just throw everything away like this." "Throw everything away?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not the one who threw everything away, Madison. You did that the moment you brought him into this house." Her gaze darted to me, panic starting to creep into her voice. "You don't have to do this. We can work something out. You don't need to go to these extremes." I shook my head slowly. "No, this is exactly what needs to happen. You've proven you can't be trusted with our lives, our family. This is the only way forward." Her hand tightened around the papers. I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes, the panic turning into something closer to desperation. She thought she could manipulate the situation, buy herself time to figure things out, but this wasn't her game to play. "Not anymore. Grant," she said, her voice breaking. I didn't think you'd take it this far. You can't take the kids from me. You can't just take everything." I met her gaze evenly. "Watch me." She stared at me, searching for any sign of hesitation, but she wouldn't find it. I was done playing the role of the understanding husband, done pretending everything could be patched up. Madison had underestimated me, and now she was beginning to understand what that mistake was going to cost her. As the silence stretched, her phone suddenly buzzed from the kitchen table. She hesitated but then grabbed it, eyes scanning the screen. It didn't take a genius to figure out who it was. Jordan, no doubt trying to check in after the bombshell I dropped last night. "Jordan," she said softly, holding the phone to her ear. "We need to talk. This is—" Whatever she said next, I tuned out. I could hear her voice getting shakier, more frantic as she spoke to him, trying to make sense of the legal ambush that had just hit her. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then again, this was what she had chosen, wasn't it? I grabbed my phone and walked back toward my office, the sound of her desperate conversation fading as I left her to grapple with the reality I'd created. By mid-afternoon, I got the call from Monica. "It's done," she said briskly, not bothering with small talk. "The papers have been served. She won't have access to the joint accounts anymore." I allowed myself a grim smile. "Good. And the prenup?" "Bulletproof," Monica confirmed. "I went through it twice. She won't get a cent in alimony. Infidelity cuts her off entirely. All you need to do is hold steady, and she walks away with nothing." I nodded, knowing full well that Monica had thought of everything. Madison hadn't realized the significance of that document when we signed it. She thought it was just legal fluff, something rich couples did to protect themselves. But she hadn't considered the consequences of betrayal. She hadn't considered me. "And the custody?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. Monica's voice was firm. "With everything you've laid out, and the evidence of her affair, I'd say you're looking at full custody. The courts don't take kindly to reckless behavior when children are involved." I let that sink in for a moment, staring out of my office window. Madison was probably still on the phone with Jordan, trying to piece together a strategy of her own. But they were out of their depth now. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of or spin to her advantage. The trap had already sprung, and all that was left was to watch her struggle in it. "What about Jordan?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Monica's tone shifted, a hint of amusement creeping into her words. "That's the interesting part. From what I've gathered, he's starting to get cold feet. There's no way he expected things to blow up this fast. He thought he could just slide in and enjoy the benefits of your life without any consequences. But now, He's starting to realize the mess he's in. I wouldn't be surprised if he cuts ties sooner than later. That, too, was something I'd expected. Jordan wasn't in this for the long haul. He was just a convenient escape for Madison, someone to indulge in her fantasy of a new life. But now, with the financial and legal weight crashing down on them, he'd be looking for the nearest exit. Let him run, I said coolly. It won't change a thing. Monica laughed lightly on the other end of the line. Oh, he will? Trust me. But we'll keep an eye on him anyway, just in case. We ended the call, and I set the phone down on my desk, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The plan was unfolding exactly as I'd hoped. Madison thought she could negotiate her way through this, delay the inevitable. But she was wrong. Everything was already in motion. Later that evening, I heard Madison's footsteps again, but this time they were quicker, more agitated. She stormed into my office, the legal papers clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was a mix of fury and fear, emotions that seemed to be battling for dominance as she stood in the doorway. Grant, this isn't fair, she said, her voice rising. You can't just freeze everything. How am I supposed to live? What about the kids? You can't take them from me. I leaned back in my chair, my expression calm. This is what you wanted, Madison. You wanted a new life, so here it is. As for the kids, I'm not taking them from you. You gave them up the moment you put yourself first. Her face contorted with frustration. I never gave them up. You're twisting this to make me look like the bad guy. I met her gaze steadily. No, Madison, you did that all on your own. She let out a small, exasperated sound, pacing the room, her mind spinning as she tried to figure out a way to regain control. But it was too late for that. She had no control left. I arrived at the courthouse early. The heavy wooden doors loomed ahead, and for a brief moment, I stood still, looking at the building as if sizing up an opponent. There was a finality about this place, a weight in the air that pressed against the chest. This was where it all came to a head, where everything that had been simmering beneath the surface would explode into the light of day. I stepped inside, the polished floors beneath my shoes amplifying every step. Monica was already waiting for me in the hallway, her sharp, confident stance immediately putting me at ease. She didn't have to say anything. Her presence alone told me she had everything under control. Ready? She asked, her voice calm, but with a hard edge of purpose. More than ever, I replied, and together we moved toward the courtroom where the final battle was about to begin. As we approached the doors, I saw Madison standing by her lawyer, visibly tense. She caught sight of me, her expression a strange mix of defiance and fear. Her lawyer was whispering something to her, no doubt trying to keep her calm, to convince her that they had a chance to salvage something from this wreckage. But we both knew the truth. The ground beneath her was already crumbling. The bailiff called for us to enter, and we walked in, Madison on one side, me on the other. The courtroom was sterile, cold. Every inch of it felt deliberate, as if it had been designed to squeeze out any lingering emotion, leaving only the facts, only the evidence. That was fine. Facts were all I needed. Judge Allison Harris entered, her robe flowing behind her like the shadow of justice itself. She took her seat, her face unreadable as she scanned the room, her eyes landing briefly on each of us before calling the session to order. Let's begin, Judge Harris said, her voice echoing through the room. Madison's lawyer was first, a man named Lewis, who I'd been told was aggressive in court. I wasn't impressed. As he stood, his crisp suit barely disguising the uncertainty in his body language, I leaned back, listening as he tried to spin Madison's affair into a story of neglect. Your Honor, Lewis began, my client has been subjected to years of emotional distance. Grant was consumed by his work, leaving Madison feeling isolated and alone. Her actions were the result of a deep emotional void, a void that was only filled when she met Jordan. This affair, while regrettable, was a consequence of a marriage already broken, and not the cause. He paused, glancing toward the judge, waiting for her reaction. She gave none. And furthermore, Lewis continued, we asked the court to consider that my client is a loving mother who never intended to abandon her children or her responsibilities. The idea that she is an unfit parent is simply inaccurate. She made a mistake, yes, but that mistake should not be used to strip her of her rights as a mother. I watched as he sat back down, clearly satisfied with his argument. Madison looked at me, her eyes pleading, as if those words were enough to erase the months of deceit. She thought this would be the turning point, the moment where I'd back down. But she was wrong. Monica stood next, rising with the confidence of someone who knew she held all the cards. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured but firm. "What we have here is not a case of emotional neglect, but a case of calculated deception." Madison didn't fall into an affair, she planned it. This wasn't about feeling lonely or isolated. It was about abandoning her responsibilities and putting herself first. Monica glanced toward me briefly, then continued. "The evidence we've presented will show that Madison misused joint funds, redirecting them for personal expenses tied directly to her relationship with Jordan. She used her children as a smokescreen while planning her escape. Not only did she betray her husband, but she also attempted to shield herself from the financial consequences by moving funds into a private account without Grant's knowledge." She motioned toward the judge. "I'd like to submit the financial documents to the court." Judge Harris nodded, allowing the evidence to be presented. Monica handed over the files. Records of every transfer, every gift, every lavish hotel booked under Madison's name for her little escapades with Jordan. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall closing in on her. I glanced toward Madison and saw the color drain from her face. She hadn't known about this. She thought she'd been careful, thought she could shift money around without it being traced. But Monica was relentless. There was no stone left unturned. The courtroom was quiet as the judge reviewed the documents, her expression still unreadable. Madison shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands wringing in her lap. I could see her lawyer leaning over, whispering urgently in her ear. Whatever he was saying, it wasn't comforting her. Monica wasn't done. "Furthermore, Your Honor," she continued, "we have testimony from multiple witnesses, including the nannies employed by the family, who have stated that Madison repeatedly left the children for extended periods, often without proper notice, in order to pursue her relationship with Jordan. This was not the behavior of a mother concerned about her children's well-being." The nanny's statements. That had been the final nail in the coffin. Monica had found them, two women who had been with us during the years Madison and I were busy with our careers. They had seen everything. Their accounts of Madison's sudden disappearances, leaving the children behind without warning, had sealed the deal. As Monica sat down, I could feel the atmosphere shift. Madison's lawyer, Lewis, stood again, but there was a tremor in his voice now. He tried to fight back, but it was clear the battle was over. Even he seemed to realize it. "Your Honor, we request that the court not overreact based on isolated incidents," Lewis said, his argument sounding hollow. "My client may have made errors in judgment, but she remains committed to her role as a mother. We ask for shared custody in the best interest of the children." Judge Harris leaned forward, her hands clasped together. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This court does not take the matter of custody lightly. However, based on the evidence presented, it is clear that Madison's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of behavior. This behavior, combined with the misuse of joint assets, is deeply troubling." She paused, her gaze falling on Madison, who was now staring down at the table, visibly shaken. "I cannot, in good conscience, award shared custody in this case," the judge concluded. "Full custody is granted to Grant. Madison will retain visitation rights, but those rights will be monitored." Madison's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Lewis was frantically shuffling papers, trying to figure out how to recover from this blow, but there was no recovery to be had. The decision was final. Judge Harris turned to me, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Grant, you have demonstrated a consistent commitment to the well-being of your children. I trust that you will continue to act in their best interests." I nodded, my face calm, though inside, the weight of victory was beginning to settle. This wasn't the time to celebrate. Not yet. Just when I thought the drama had peaked, Monica leaned over and whispered something to me, something that made my eyes narrow with intrigue. Jordan didn't show up. I turned to look at Madison, and suddenly, it all made sense. She had been expecting him. She thought he'd be here to stand by her side, to help explain away the affair. But Jordan had disappeared. No testimony, no support. He'd left her to face this alone. It was a twist I hadn't seen coming, but it made perfect sense. Jordan wasn't in this for the long haul. He'd never been planning to stick around once the fallout hit. Now, with everything falling apart, he'd vanished, unwilling to face the consequences of the life they'd tried to build on lies. The final blow came as Monica stood once more. "Your Honor, one final piece of evidence has surfaced. We have records showing that Madison had not only been planning to leave her husband, but had been quietly funneling funds into a private account, anticipating her departure. These funds were meant to ensure she could live comfortably once the divorce was settled. An act of premeditation that further demonstrates her lack of commitment to this marriage and her disregard for the financial trust placed in her." The room seemed to freeze. Madison's face drained of all color. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Judge Harris reviewing the newly submitted documents. It was over. As the gavel came down, sealing the verdict, I stood up, the weight of this battle finally lifting from my shoulders. Madison remained seated, stunned, her eyes flicking from her lawyer to the empty seat where Jordan should have been. She had bet everything on a lie, and now she had nothing left. Monica nodded to me as we left the courtroom, her work done. As for me, I walked out knowing that this was just the beginning of Madison's fall. There were still pieces left to pick up, but I had one. The rest would be easier now. And Jordan? He'd disappeared, but not for long. People like him didn't vanish completely. I'd find him eventually. But for now, I had my life back, and that was all that mattered. The echo of my footsteps bounced off the hallway walls as I made my way to the next phase of the battle. The divorce was already swinging in my favor, but this part was personal. Custody of my children. Everything else was about money, pride, control. But this was about family. I couldn't let Madison twist this around. Not after what she'd done. Not after how she'd left them for her little affair while pretending to still be a mother. I pushed open the door to the small, private conference room where the guardian ad litem was waiting. The woman was older, with sharp eyes that had clearly seen the worst family breakdowns. Her job was to represent the best interests of my children, and I knew I'd done everything to make sure that was me. Madison's neglect during her affair with Jordan was undeniable, and I had the proof to back it up. She greeted me with a firm handshake. "Grant," she said, "we'll be going over everything today. The interviews with the children have been conducted, and I've reviewed the reports you provided about your involvement in their lives." I nodded, taking my seat across from her. "I assume you've seen the discrepancies as well?" She opened a thick folder, leafing through several pages. "Yes, it's very clear that you've been the more present parent. School drop-offs, pickups, playdates, medical appointments. All of those are well documented." I sat back, trying to keep my calm. I had spent weeks preparing for this, compiling every piece of evidence that showed my commitment to my children. Every playdate I'd organized, every school event I'd attended, and every time I'd rearranged my busy schedule to make sure I was there for them. I'd made it a priority, even when Madison was drifting away. "Madison will likely argue that your work demands as a CEO make it difficult for you to provide full-time care," the guardian continued, her eyes scanning me for a reaction. I nodded, already prepared for that angle. "I expected that, but I've made adjustments. I've delegated more responsibilities at work, and I've made arrangements to ensure that my children's needs come first." I can't say the same for her. She raised an eyebrow. "Go on." I leaned forward slightly, my hands clasped together. "She's been absent for the past year. The gym sessions were an excuse to meet Jordan. I have records of her frequent absences and how often she left the children with nannies. She prioritized her affair over her responsibilities as a mother. They've noticed it. They felt it." The guardian didn't respond immediately, but I could see the gears turning in her mind. She had the facts in front of her, and now she was weighing them against the emotional toll this had taken on the kids. I knew Madison had let them down, and now it was all coming to light. "The interviews with the children were telling," she said, pulling out another sheet of paper. They've both expressed how much they rely on you, how present you've been in their lives. Your son, especially, mentioned how he's noticed Madison's absences. He doesn't understand why she's not around as much anymore. My heart clenched slightly at that. It was one thing to know what she'd done, but hearing that my son had been hurt by it, there were no words for the anger that flared in my chest. I held it in though. This wasn't the time for emotion. I had to keep it together. The guardian closed the folder, folding her hands neatly on top. It's clear that your children are more attached to you. Based on the interviews and the records you've provided, it's hard to argue otherwise. There was the turning point. I kept my voice steady, though inside, a sense of relief started to take hold. So, what's next? Next, she said, we present this to the judge. You build a solid case, Grant. Full custody is well within your reach. I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. I couldn't afford to lose this part. Losing the marriage was one thing. Losing my children was not an option. We reconvened in the courtroom later that afternoon, the stakes higher than ever. Madison sat across from me, her expression tense, but still clinging to a glimmer of hope that she could somehow salvage this. Her lawyer, Lewis, was whispering hurried instructions, clearly rattled by how things were going. Monica, of course, was a picture of calm confidence beside me. She leaned over just before the proceedings began and whispered, "Stay sharp. This is the final stretch." I nodded. I had no plans to let my guard down. Judge Harris entered the room, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. She called the session to order, and we dove straight into the custody discussion. Madison's lawyer tried, as expected, to attack my role as a father by emphasizing my busy career. He tried to paint a picture of an absent CEO who couldn't possibly manage full custody. But it was a weak argument, and he knew it. Monica countered swiftly, presenting the evidence of Madison's absences, the nanny's testimonies, and the documentation of every time she left the children to pursue her affair with Jordan. The guardian's report was the final blow. Her professional assessment of the children's well-being and their attachment to me was irrefutable. "Your Honor," Monica said as she stood to make her final statement, "it's clear from all evidence presented that Grant has been the primary caregiver for his children. His involvement is consistent, his commitment unwavering. Meanwhile, Madison's actions have demonstrated a neglectful pattern, prioritizing her personal life over her duties as a mother." Lewis stood, attempting a last-ditch effort to sway the judge. "Your Honor, we don't deny there were lapses in judgment, but we ask the court to consider that Madison is still their mother, and separating her from her children entirely would be damaging to their emotional health." Judge Harris listened carefully, her hands clasped together as she weighed the arguments. The room was tense, everyone waiting for the next word that would decide everything. "I have reviewed all the evidence," the judge finally said, her voice steady. "I have read the guardian's report, considered the testimonies, and examined the financial records presented. This is not a decision the court makes lightly. However, based on everything before me, it is clear that Madison has shown a pattern of neglect toward her children. Her involvement with Jordan and her frequent absences have undeniably impacted their emotional well-being." Madison shifted in her seat, her eyes darting anxiously toward the judge. "Full custody is granted to Grant," Judge Harris declared, her gavel hitting the desk with a finality that echoed through the room. "Madison will have visitation rights, but those rights will be monitored and limited, pending further evaluation." I let out a slow breath, the weight of the moment sinking in. It was done. Madison's plans for shared custody had crumbled, and there was nothing left for her to grasp onto. Madison's face paled, her mouth opening as if to protest, but Lewis put a hand on her arm, shaking his head slightly. It was over, and even she knew it now. As the courtroom emptied, I stood, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. I glanced back at Madison, who remained seated, staring down at the table in front of her. She had gambled everything: her marriage, her family, and now, her future with the kids. And she had lost it all. Monica approached me, her usual sharpness softened just slightly by the victory. "That's that," she said. "You did it." I nodded. "No, we did it." By the time I reached my car, the reality of what had just happened was starting to settle in. My children were safe now, out of Madison's unstable grasp. They were going to be okay. But this wasn't just about winning a courtroom battle. This was the end of a life Madison and I had once shared, a life I had fought for, but one that had been poisoned by her choices. And now, there was only one thing left to do: rebuild. But first, there was something else. One loose end that hadn't yet been tied up. Jordan. He had slipped away from the courtroom, vanished when the pressure got too high. But I hadn't forgotten him, and he wasn't out of my sight just yet. I stood at the edge of the driveway, the family home looming behind me. The for sale sign swung lazily in the breeze, a silent testament to the final chapter of this life. The house had always been a symbol of everything I'd built, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, tied to memories that had once meant something. But now, it was just an empty shell, tainted by betrayal and deception. I had no use for it anymore. I was moving on, and this house needed to be part of the past. The kids were with my sister for the weekend, and the movers had already cleared most of the furniture. A few last boxes remained inside, but those could wait. Today was about cutting ties. It was about letting go of the life I'd shared with Madison, the life she had destroyed with her reckless choices. Selling the house was just the final step in that process. I turned to the front door and walked inside, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the bare walls. Each room felt like a memory frozen in time, but none of them held any real power over me anymore. Not after what had happened. I'd won the divorce. I had custody of my children, and Madison was left to face the aftermath of her choices alone. Madison. I hadn't heard from her since the courtroom battle ended, but I knew she was out there, somewhere, trying to piece together the wreckage of her life. She'd been stripped of alimony, her parental rights reduced to monitored visitation. And Jordan? He'd ghosted her. I hadn't been surprised when I heard he'd left her to deal with the fallout by herself. The moment things got difficult, he'd vanished like smoke. He was never in it for the long haul. Madison had gambled everything on that man, and now she had nothing. But there was something satisfying about that, knowing that she was experiencing the cold reality of the consequences. I checked my phone, scrolling through emails about the sale of the house. Everything was moving quickly, just as I'd wanted. The offer I'd accepted was above asking. And with the paperwork nearly finalized, it wouldn't be long before I could start fresh with my kids, far from the poison that had infected this place. I could breathe easier knowing the past wouldn't be weighing me down anymore. And then the phone buzzed. For a moment, I ignored it. It was probably another message from the realtor or the movers. But when it buzzed again, I glanced at the screen. It was Madison. Her name flashing on my phone stirred something inside me. But it wasn't the same mix of anger and pain that I had felt before. Now, it was almost an irritation, like an itch I didn't want to scratch. I wasn't curious about what she had to say, but I also knew ignoring her wouldn't make her go away. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. Madison. There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a shaky breath. "Grant," she said softly. Her voice was different now, stripped of the bravado and defiance that she'd clung to throughout the divorce. This was a Madison who had been knocked down, a woman who had lost everything. "I didn't think you'd pick up," she continued, her tone almost apologetic. "Why are you calling, Madison?" I asked, cutting to the point. I wasn't interested in small talk, and I had no time for whatever sob story she was about to lay at my feet. There was another pause, and I could almost picture her on the other end, nervous, uncertain. I've been thinking about everything," she said. "About the kids. About us." I stayed silent, letting her fill the space with her words. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. "I know I made mistakes, Grant. I know I hurt you, hurt them." Her voice cracked slightly, and she swallowed hard, trying to keep it together. "But I've been trying to rebuild. I've been trying to figure out how to fix things." I could hear the desperation creeping into her tone now. "Fix things?" I repeated, my voice flat. "Yes," she said quickly. "I don't know how, but I thought maybe we could talk. Maybe we could figure something out. I'm still their mother, and I—" "Stop," I said firmly, cutting her off. The words came out sharper than I expected, but I wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative now. "You made your choice, Madison. You chose him. You chose that life. There's no going back." "But," she started again, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for it to end like this. I didn't mean for everything to fall apart. I miss them, Grant. I miss the kids. I miss what we had. The sound of her pleading voice, the regret that dripped from every word, might have affected me once. But not now. I wasn't the same man who had been blindsided by her betrayal. I wasn't the man who had spent sleepless nights wondering what I could have done differently. That man was gone. You miss the life you threw away, I said coldly. You miss the stability, the security. But you don't miss me. And you don't get to use the kids as leverage now. The silence on the other end was heavy, her breath hitching slightly as she processed the finality of what I was saying. I could feel her reaching, grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing left for her here. Grant, please. Her voice was barely a whisper now, a last-ditch effort to claw her way back into something that no longer existed. I just need a second chance. Maybe we could. No, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. There's no second chance, Madison. You made your choice. Now live with it. The words hung between us for a moment, sinking into the silence that followed. And then, without waiting for a response, I ended the call. I stood there, phone in hand, the weight of that final conversation settling on my shoulders. It wasn't anger that filled me now, it was closure. Madison had played her game, and she'd lost. There was no going back. I looked around the empty house one last time. The memories were there, but they felt distant, like something that belonged to someone else. It was time to move on for good. As I stepped out onto the driveway, the sun setting behind the trees, I could feel the weight lifting. The house was sold. The kids were safe. And Madison? She was nothing more than a reminder of the past, a cautionary tale of what happens when you gamble and lose. This was my fresh start. And as for Jordan, he had vanished, leaving Madison behind without so much as a backward glance. I'd be keeping an eye on him, though. People like him didn't stay gone for long. But for now, he was irrelevant. Madison was irrelevant. All that mattered now was the future. A future that didn't include her. I glanced at the for sale sign one last time before getting into my car. The past was behind me, and I wasn't looking back. Not anymore. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.